Stop for a moment. Today, America celebrates freedom. Flags rise into the air. Streets prepare for music, voices, gatherings, bright colors, and fire in the sky. Families remember a nation that once said no to a distant throne. Children hear the word liberty before they fully understand its weight. Adults speak of independence with pride, gratitude, and sometimes with a silence deeper than celebration. But beneath the sound of this day, another question is moving toward you. It is not loud, it does not compete with the crowd, it does not need fireworks to announce itself. It waits inside the private chamber of your own awareness and asks with terrifying tenderness, are you truly free? Not free because a document says you are. Not free because a flag moves above you. Not free because the world allows you to work, travel, buy, speak, post, choose, and dream. Those freedoms matter. They were paid for with courage, risk, sacrifice, and blood. But there is another freedom that no government can grant and no government can take away unless you surrender it from within. It is the freedom of the mind that no longer bows to fear. It is the freedom of the soul that no longer kneels before guilt. It is the freedom of the imagination that no longer accepts limitation as law. It is the freedom of a human being who has remembered the throne within. A nation can declare independence from a king, and still a person can remain ruled by anxiety. A people can separate from an empire, and still a soul can remain trapped in the empire of the past. A city can be filled with celebration, and still a man can go home carrying invisible chains around his thoughts. A woman can smile beneath the lights and still feel imprisoned by the voice that says she is not enough. This is the strange truth of human liberty. The outer world may open its gates, while the inner world remains locked from the inside. That is why this book has found you today. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, today. On a day when the outer world is speaking of freedom, your inner world is being invited to make a declaration of its own. This is not about politics. This is not about parties, governments, arguments, headlines, or the noise that divides people from one another. This is about the territory within you. This is about the private kingdom of thought, memory, belief, imagination, and identity. This is about the laws you obey in silence, the fears you have mistaken for wisdom, and the old wounds that have been pretending to protect you while secretly limiting your life. The Declaration of Independence spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But perhaps those words have a deeper chamber. Life is not merely breathing. It is the awakening of the power that has been asleep inside you. Liberty is not merely permission from the outer world. It is mastery over the inner world that once mastered you. Happiness is not merely something chased through possessions, praise, romance, recognition, or success. It is something received by a soul that is no longer at war with itself. Ralph Waldo Emerson understood that the integrity of your own mind is sacred. Henry David Thoreau withdrew into quiet because he knew the noise of the world can drown the voice of truth. William James saw that belief is not decoration. Belief is a force that changes the way a life is experienced, endured, chosen, and built. Joseph Murphy taught that the subconscious mind receives the impressions repeated with feeling until those impressions become hidden instructions. These minds were not speaking in the same language, from the same doorway, or for the same purpose. Yet they all point toward one burning secret. The human being is not free, while the inner world is governed by unexamined fear. So today, before the lights rise into the night, listen inwardly. Who has been programming your mind? Who has been sitting on the throne within you? What fear has been writing your laws? What memory has been limiting your future? What old wound has been pretending to be discernment? What disappointment has been disguising itself as maturity? What voice have you allowed to become more authoritative than the voice of your own awakening? This book is not here to flatter you. It is here to interrupt the pattern. It is here to place a question in your hands that cannot be returned unopened. You may discover that some of the chains around your life were never locked. They were repeated. You may discover that certain prisons were built not from steel, but from conclusions you made in pain. You may discover that the version of you who has been surviving is not the version of you who was born to rule your inner kingdom. Survival kept you alive, but survival was never meant to become your throne. If this message feels as though it reached you at the exact moment you needed it, remain close to this path. Some books do not arrive to entertain you. They arrive to awaken the part of you that has been waiting beneath the noise. They arrive when the soul is ready to stop negotiating with fear. Today can become more than a national celebration. Today can become a private declaration. Fear is no longer your master. Guilt is no longer your identity. The past is no longer your prison, and your mind, your soul, your imagination, and your inner authority are being returned to you. This is the declaration of inner freedom, and if this book found you on July 4th, it is for a reason. Chapter 1. The Chains No One Can See. There are chains that make noise when they move, and there are chains so familiar that the person wearing them no longer hears them. The most dangerous chains are not always placed on the wrists. They are placed around assumptions. They are wrapped around conclusions made in childhood, after betrayal, after embarrassment, after failure, after grief, after the moment someone important looked at you and made you feel small. Years pass, the body grows, the calendar changes, the face matures, responsibilities increase, yet somewhere in the inner world, an old command continues to operate. Do not risk, do not speak, do not trust, do not rise too high, do not expect too much. Do not become visible because visibility once brought pain. This is why a person can live in a free country and still feel imprisoned. The prison is not always built by law. Sometimes it is built by repetition. A thought repeated long enough begins to sound like truth. A fear obeyed long enough begins to sound like wisdom. A wound protected long enough begins to sound like identity. The chain becomes invisible because it no longer feels foreign. It learns your tone. It borrows your history. It speaks with the confidence of evidence, and because you have heard it for so long, you forget to ask whether it is actually yours. Consider fear. In its first form, fear is a signal. It tells the body to pay attention. It helps you survive a real danger. But when fear is repeated in the imagination, when it is rehearsed without examination, it becomes more than a signal. It becomes a ruler. It begins to govern the future before the future arrives. The same is true of guilt. Guilt can correct a true mistake, but when it becomes an identity, it no longer heals. It imprisons. Regret can teach, but when regret becomes a permanent atmosphere, it narrows the imagination. Shame can reveal where compassion is needed, but when shame becomes law, it convinces the soul to hide from its own light. The first work of freedom is inspection. Not performance, not denial, inspection. You look at the thought, the reflex, the emotional contraction, and the old conclusion, and you ask, who gave this the right to govern me? That question is a torch. It lights the corridor you were trained not to enter. Carl Jung gives this work necessary seriousness because he understood that what remains unconscious does not remain powerless. It moves beneath choice. It disguises itself as mood, attraction, avoidance, judgment, and fate. When the hidden fear is not seen, it becomes a ruler. When the hidden wound is not named, it becomes a law. Awareness is therefore not a luxury for spiritual people. Awareness is an act of liberation. But do not hate the old self for creating these protections. There was a time when caution, silence, withdrawal, or self-protection may have helped you survive. A pattern can begin as mercy and later become a prison. Inner freedom requires gratitude without continued submission. You can thank the pattern for what it tried to do and still remove it from authority. Imagine a prisoner sitting in a room whose door has been open for years. No guard stands outside. No lock holds the frame. The prison remains only because the body has forgotten how to stand. That is the condition of many inner lives. Something in you has been waiting for permission to rise, breathe, speak, choose, and imagine again. But permission is not coming from outside. The deepest permission is issued within. The old pattern was installed through repetition. The new freedom must also be installed through repetition. Each time you refuse to obey the reflex of shame, a new road is carved. Each time you choose awareness over automatic reaction, the soul recovers territory. Freedom does not mean pretending the wound was small. It does not mean calling pain an illusion. It means refusing to let pain be the final legislator of your life. It means allowing memory to become information without allowing it to become a prison. It means standing before fear, guilt, regret, approval, scarcity, shame, comparison, anxiety, and the old identity and saying, "You may speak, but you may not rule." The first prison is the one that feels normal. Do not rush past that sentence. Let it test the private laws you have been obeying. Freedom is proven when the old master calls, and you do not come back as a servant. Chapter 2, the First Declaration. Every visible revolution begins as an invisible refusal. Before the crowd sees courage, before the world sees action, before any outer door opens, there is a private moment when something inside a person says, "I can no longer obey what has been reducing me." That moment may not look dramatic. No one may applaud. The room may remain quiet. The face may remain calm. But beneath the calm, authority has shifted. A fear that once gave orders is suddenly questioned. A memory that once defined the future is suddenly challenged. An old identity that once seemed permanent is suddenly placed on trial. The first declaration is not spoken to the world. It is spoken to the inner ruler that has been demanding obedience. It says, "You may have protected me once, but you may no longer govern me. You may have entered through pain, but you may not build a kingdom there. I will not confuse survival with destiny." This is the beginning of true liberty, because no person becomes free merely by changing location, relationships, work, clothing, or public identity. Freedom begins when obedience is withdrawn from the pattern that has been feeding on attention. Many people wait for a perfect moment before making this declaration. They wait until fear disappears, until others understand, until the path is guaranteed, until the body no longer trembles. But the first declaration is powerful precisely because it is made before the outer evidence is complete. It is not the end of fear. It is the end of fear's legal authority. Benjamin Franklin remains useful here because he understood that liberty can be traded away for the promise of safety. That idea is not only political, it is psychological. Every time a person exchanges calling for comfort, truth for approval, courage for predictability, or vitality for acceptance, a private bargain is made. The soul receives temporary relief, but it pays with life force. Comfort is not evil. Comfort becomes dangerous only when it becomes a master. A bed is a blessing when the body needs rest. It becomes a prison when the soul uses it to avoid the morning. Familiarity can be kind. It becomes a chain when it convinces you that the known cage is safer than the unknown sky. There comes a day when the soul must cancel certain agreements. Perhaps you once agreed never to be fully visible, because being seen brought judgment. Perhaps you agreed never to want too much because disappointment hurt. Perhaps you agreed never to trust because betrayal burned. These agreements may have been signed in pain, but they were never meant to become permanent law. The first declaration is the moment you take the pen back. It may be a sentence spoken in silence. It may be written in a journal. It may be whispered in a parked car during a walk before sleep or while fireworks are rising in the distance. The outer form is not the power. The power is the transfer of authority. You are no longer asking fear what your life is allowed to become. Do not confuse this with rebellion for its own sake. Inner declaration is not reckless. It does not despise wisdom. It simply stops calling terror by the name of wisdom. It stops pretending that every small life is a safe life. It stops letting the nervous system dictate destiny from a record of old injuries. The first declaration must be followed by repetition. A single sentence can open the door, but repeated obedience to the new law is what carries you through it. Tomorrow the old reflex may return. The familiar fear may tighten the chest. Doubt may pretend to be intelligence. The inner critic may speak with the voice of realism. That is when the declaration must be practiced. Freedom begins when obedience is withdrawn from the thing that diminished you. Let this become your first private law, not a slogan, not a decoration, a law. When the old master calls, do not answer as the old servant. Stand still. Breathe. Remember that the command is familiar, not sacred. Then choose from the authority of the awakened self. No revolution is real until it changes the daily government. Your declaration must enter your speech, your schedule, your decisions, your imagination, your relationships, and your silence. It must touch the ordinary hour after the inspiration has faded. It must remain alive when no one is watching. Today, on July 4th, the symbol outside you becomes a mirror inside you. The public language of independence asks a private question: What have you continued to obey that no longer has the right to rule? Answer clearly, answer with your life. Chapter 3. The Kingdom Within. There is a kingdom within you, and every day something is governing it. Thoughts pass through it like messengers. Images rise in it like banners. Emotions move through it like weather. Memories stand in it like monuments. Expectations sit in it like judges. Repeated phrases become its laws. Secret fears become its borders. The question is not whether you have an inner kingdom. The question is whether that kingdom is awake, ordered and ruled by authority, or whether it has been left open to every voice that ever frightened, disappointed, rejected, or diminished you. Many people treat the mind as if it were a hallway. They allow anything to walk through. They let the news enter without guard. They let old insults return without challenge. They let imagined failure rehearse itself until the nervous system bows before it. They let other people's opinions sit in the royal chair of decision. Then they wonder why the outer life feels disorganized. But the outer life often reflects the inner government. A neglected kingdom produces confusion. A surrendered kingdom produces fear. A disciplined kingdom produces direction. Joseph Murphy and Neville Goddard meet at an important doorway. One points toward the subconscious as a receptive depth. The other points toward imagination as a creative act. Together, they remind you that the inner world is not passive. It receives, rehearses, believes, and then begins to organize perception around what has been accepted as true. If fear is repeated with feeling, fear becomes instruction. If freedom is imagined with authority, freedom becomes a new internal climate. The point is not fantasy. The point is inner legislation. You are always impressing something upon the depths of yourself. The question is whether you are impressing captivity or command. Attention is the currency of this kingdom. Whatever receives attention receives energy. Whatever receives energy grows in authority. If you give your attention every morning to disaster, resentment, comparison, and panic, do not be surprised when those forces become ministers in your inner government. If you give attention to courage, vision, gratitude, and deliberate assumption, the kingdom changes leadership. This does not mean you pretend pain does not exist. A wise ruler does not deny the wounded citizens of the kingdom. He listens, he sees, he cares, but he does not hand the throne to the loudest wound. Compassion is not surrender. Awareness is not weakness. A healed kingdom can honor pain without letting pain write the constitution. Your mind is not a hallway for passing thoughts. It is a kingdom that must be governed. This governance begins in small places. It begins when you notice a repeated sentence and refuse to let it become identity. It begins when you catch yourself rehearsing rejection and choose not to finish the scene. It begins when you stop calling self-betrayal humility. It begins when you guard the first hour of the morning because you understand that the mind is most impressionable before the world begins shouting. The old self may resist this order. It may call discipline rigid. It may call focus unrealistic. It may call vision childish. But often the old self is not defending truth. It is defending familiarity. It would rather keep the kingdom poor and known than rich and new. The kingdom within requires borders. Not walls of fear, but borders of reverence. You must decide what enters your attention. You must decide what voices are allowed to influence your identity. You must decide which memories may advise you and which memories must be retired from public office. Some thoughts are visitors. They may knock, they may speak, they may warn, but they may not move in and redecorate the throne room. When the inner government changes, the outer behavior begins to follow. You stop moving like someone asking to be allowed. You begin moving like someone who has remembered responsibility. You speak less from panic and more from authority. You choose less from injury and more from vision. You stop begging the future to be kind and begin training the mind to become worthy of the future you are building. A free mind is not a mind without thoughts. A free mind is a mind with a sovereign center. Storms still pass, old voices still visit, doubt still knocks, but the throne is no longer vacant. Pause inside this sentence. Your mind is a kingdom that must be governed. Let it test your day, let it test your habits, let it test the private laws you have been obeying. The new life does not begin in some distant future. It begins at the first moment when the old pattern calls your name, and you remember that you are no longer required to come. Chapter 4. The False Masters. Every inner kingdom has a throne, and if you do not sit there with awareness, something else will. This is one of the great tragedies of human life. People spend years decorating the outer house, while false masters govern the inner house. They study how to appear confident, while fear signs the decrees. They learn how to sound peaceful, while resentment keeps the keys. They gather achievements while insecurity counts them, and says they are still not enough. The throne does not remain empty. Something will occupy it, and whatever occupies it will shape the laws of your life. The false masters rarely announce themselves as enemies. Fear arrives as caution, doubt arrives as intelligence, guilt arrives as conscience, regret arrives as maturity, poverty thinking arrives as realism, approval arrives as love, resentment arrives as justice, the past arrives as identity. Because each one wears a respectable mask, the soul often bows before them without realizing it is bowing. The first work of freedom is recognition. You cannot remove a ruler you refuse to name. Fear as a ruler always speaks in the language of prevention. It does not say, "I want to shrink your destiny." It says, "I only want to keep you safe." It tells you not to speak, not to risk, not to attempt, not to love, not to begin. At first it sounds protective. Over time it becomes ownership. Doubt as a ruler is more sophisticated. It wears the robe of intelligence. It does not shout, it cross-examines. It asks for more evidence, more certainty, more preparation, more guarantee. Used properly, doubt can refine a decision. Worshipped blindly, doubt becomes a permanent postponement of life. Guilt as a ruler does not correct wrongdoing. It manufactures servitude. It keeps the soul paying for mistakes long after the lesson has been learned. It says that joy would be betrayal. It says freedom would be selfish. It says, you must remain small to prove you are sorry. Regret as a ruler pretends to be a historian, but it edits the record with cruelty. It repeats the scene, but never the growth that came from it. It reminds you of the fall, but not the strength that stood up afterward. It keeps you kneeling before a past that cannot be changed, while stealing authority from the present that can. Approval as a ruler is one of the sweetest tyrants. It smiles, it promises belonging. It tells you that if everyone likes you, you will finally rest. But the cost is high. You must exile the inconvenient parts of yourself. You must become fluent in performance. You must measure your worth by the weather of other people's reactions. Ralph Waldo Emerson stands behind this chapter like a clear bell. His deepest usefulness is not in a quotation, but in the challenge of self-trust. To trust yourself is not to worship impulse. It is to stop betraying the clear voice within you merely because the crowd is louder. Self-trust removes the false masters one by one. It does not mean you never receive counsel. It means counsel is not crowned above conscience. It means the crowd may speak, the past may speak, fear may speak, and the wound may speak, but the final authority returns to the soul. Do not fight these false masters with hatred. Hatred binds you to them. Recognize them, name them, thank them for whatever role they once played in survival, then remove them from the throne. Say to fear, you may warn me, but you may not own me. Say to guilt, you may teach me, but you may not define me. Say to regret, you may inform me, but you may not imprison me. Say to approval, you may visit, but you may not determine my worth. Say to the past, you may be part of my story, but you are not the author of my destiny. This is the ceremony of removal. It may happen quietly, but it is no small act. Every person has an inner throne, and the tragedy is that many never ask who is sitting there. Ask today. Ask without fear. Ask with the seriousness of one who understands that the answer determines the shape of a life. The false masters lose power the moment the true ruler awakens. Chapter 5. The fire above, the fire within. On this day, the sky itself becomes a symbol. Fire rises, bursts, disappears, and leaves the night altered for a moment. People look upward, because light has always had power over the human heart. A flame can gather attention. A spark can make silence. A bright explosion can make even a distracted crowd pause. Yet there is another fire that does not depend on powder, celebration, or public display. It is the fire that begins inside consciousness when a person finally sees the truth and cannot unsee it. The fire above is beautiful, but it is temporary. It appears, shines, and dissolves. The fire within is different. It may begin quietly, as discomfort, a question, a holy restlessness, a refusal to keep living beneath your own capacity. It may begin as the realization that you have been praising freedom in public while negotiating with fear in private. It may begin when you no longer believe the old story, even though you do not yet know the new one. This inner fire does not entertain, it purifies. Henry David Thoreau matters here because he trusted silence enough to let it reveal what society often conceals. He saw that noise can become a form of sleep. The crowd may be celebrating, the sky may be burning with light, but the soul still needs an inner Walden, a quiet place where truth can rise without being interrupted. The free person must learn to hear the flame within, especially when the outer world is full of spectacle. Noise is not always sound. Noise can be comparison. Noise can be opinion. Noise can be the endless urgency of people who have never sat still long enough to know what they truly serve. Noise can be a schedule so crowded that the soul has no room to confess its hunger. Noise can be entertainment used as anesthesia. Noise can be the constant management of an image, while the real self waits in exile. The fire within requires oxygen, and oxygen is attention. Whatever you attend to receives breath. If you attend only to panic, panic burns. If you attend only to resentment, resentment burns. But if you attend to truth, courage, silence, and sacred vision, the inner fire becomes clean. It becomes a flame that warms without destroying. The sky can be lit for a moment, but consciousness can be lit for a lifetime. This sentence is not decoration. It is an invitation. Outer celebration can awaken memory, but it cannot maintain your liberation for you. After the fireworks fade, you must tend the flame. You must return to silence. You must listen to what remains after the crowd has left. What does your inner fire want to burn? Perhaps it wants to burn the need to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. Perhaps it wants to burn the old agreement that your worth depends on applause. Perhaps it wants to burn the idea that delay is humility. Perhaps it wants to burn the fear of becoming too visible, too powerful, too alive. Fire is frightening because it changes the shape of what it touches. But not all burning is destruction. Some burning is purification. Gold is tested by fire. A field is renewed by controlled flame. A candle gives itself away to become light. You may feel this fire as tension in the chest, pressure behind the ribs, a sudden seriousness, a sense that the old life is too small. Do not immediately call it anxiety. Sometimes what you call anxiety is the soul pressing against the walls of a life that no longer fits. Sometimes the nervous system trembles, not because something is wrong, but because something true is asking to be born. Learn the difference between panic and awakening. Panic scatters you. Awakening gathers you. Panic says, run anywhere. Awakening says, stand here and become honest. Panic tightens the future. Awakening enlarges it, even if the first doorway is uncomfortable. When the sky burns tonight, let it be a mirror. Let every burst of light ask what in you is ready to ignite. Let every fading spark remind you that spectacle is not enough. Let the silence after the explosion teach you that the deepest transformations are often quiet. You do not need the whole world to see your inner fire. You only need to stop hiding it from yourself. Chapter 6. The pursuit of happiness was never external. The pursuit of happiness can become a beautiful phrase or a lifelong misunderstanding. Many people hear those words and imagine movement towards something outside themselves. More money, more praise, more beauty, more recognition, more comfort, more proof, more applause, more certainty, more control. They run with sincerity. They chase with discipline. They improve, acquire, achieve, and perform. Yet after every arrival, the hunger returns. The soul whispers that something is still missing, not because the outer things are evil, but because no outer possession can repair an inner captivity. Happiness pursued by an unfree mind becomes dependency. The person begins to need the world to behave perfectly before peace is allowed. They need others to approve before they can rest. They need evidence before they can believe. They need comparison before they can feel valuable. They need success before they can stop apologizing for existing. That is not happiness, that is negotiation. True happiness requires inner liberty, because joy cannot breathe inside a mind that is always asking permission from fear. William James helps us understand why happiness cannot be separated from belief. A human being does not encounter life in a neutral state. We meet life through expectation, interpretation, faith, fear, memory, and meaning. Belief becomes architecture. It shapes the hallway through which events are experienced. Two people can stand before the same opportunity. One sees danger, the other sees invitation. The difference is not only circumstance, the difference is the inner structure through which circumstance is received. This does not mean that the outer world is irrelevant. Food matters, shelter matters, love matters, money matters, safety matters. The mistake is not in valuing outer conditions. The mistake is in making the soul a hostage to them. If peace can only exist when every external condition is perfect, peace will always be fragile. If happiness depends entirely on applause, then silence will feel like death. If worth depends on comparison, then another person's success will always feel like theft. If joy depends on control, then every uncertainty will become an enemy. The pursuit of happiness was never meant to be a desperate chase by an exhausted self. It was meant to be the movement of an aligned self toward a life that expresses its nature. There is a difference between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is a sensation. It comes and goes. It is not wrong. It can be sweet, healing, and human. But happiness is deeper. Happiness is coherence. It is the feeling of not being divided against yourself. It is the relief of living in a way that does not constantly betray the soul. A person may have pleasure and still be miserable because the inner life remains occupied. A person may face difficulty and still know a strange happiness because the inner throne has been reclaimed. The old world trained many people to chase approval, chase status, chase romance, chase certainty, chase a future version of yourself who will finally deserve rest. But a free soul learns to receive as well as move. It learns that some things come not by panic, but by alignment. It learns that joy grows when the inner life stops negotiating with the old wound. Ask yourself with honesty, what have I been calling happiness that is actually dependency? What have I been chasing because I do not yet feel free to receive? What achievement have I demanded in order to feel worthy of the breath already in my lungs? Happiness cannot be chased by a mind that remains captive to fear. This is not a condemnation. It is mercy. It means the work is not only to run harder, improve more, earn more, impress more, or become more visible. The work is to free the one who is doing the pursuing. When the inner captive is released, desire becomes cleaner. You may still want abundance, love, beauty, recognition, and success, but you no longer want them from desperation. You want them as expressions of life, not as proof that you are allowed to exist. That shift changes everything. Today, on a day when a nation celebrates liberty, examine your pursuit. Is it born from freedom or from fear? Is it guided by the soul or by comparison? Is it an expression of your becoming or a bargain with your insecurity? The pursuit of happiness begins to become sacred when the pursuer is no longer in chains. Chapter 7. Breaking the Contract with Fear. Fear is not only an emotion. Fear is often a contract. Somewhere along the road, after pain, disappointment, humiliation, loss, or shock, the soul may have made an agreement without realizing it. It may have said, "If I stay small, I will be safe. If I do not speak, I will not be rejected. If I do not love deeply, I will not be wounded. If I do not try, I will not fail. If I do not want too much, I will not be disappointed." Fear offered safety, and the wounded self signed quickly. The problem is that fear rarely keeps only the pain away. It keeps life away. It keeps the calling away. It keeps intimacy away. It keeps abundance away. It keeps visibility away. It keeps the next version of you waiting outside the door. Fear presents itself as protection, but over time it becomes ownership. It says, "I saved you once, therefore I own your future." And many people live decades paying debt to a fear that was never meant to become their master. Joseph Campbell reminds us that every life contains a call, and every call asks the familiar self to cross a threshold. Fear always stands near that threshold, not because the threshold is wrong, but because the threshold is real. The old identity knows it may not survive the crossing. That is why fear whispers, "Later, not yet, be careful, stay here." But the heroic life does not begin when fear disappears. It begins when obedience to fear ends. Look carefully at your own contract. What did you agree to after pain? Did you agree to never need anyone? Did you agree to never show your work? Did you agree to never ask for more? Did you agree to hide your intelligence, beauty, power, tenderness, ambition, or spiritual hunger? Did you agree to remain manageable so others would not feel threatened by your rising? Some agreements are written in words, others are written in the body. The throat tightens before truth. The stomach contracts before risk. The shoulders close before visibility. The nervous system says no before the soul can say yes. This is not proof that the calling is wrong. It may be proof that the old contract is being challenged. Breaking the contract with fear is not the same as becoming careless. A free person still listens to danger. A free person still respects discernment. But discernment is clear, specific, and calm. Fear is repetitive, vague, and possessive. Discernment protects life. Fear often protects identity. To break the contract, you must first name it. Say it plainly. I made an agreement to stay small. I made an agreement to avoid rejection. I made an agreement to expect loss. I made an agreement to distrust hope. I made an agreement to abandon myself before others could abandon me. Then speak the cancellation. This agreement is no longer valid. It was signed in pain. It was signed by a wounded version of me. It may have tried to protect me, but it no longer has authority over my future. The body may tremble when you do this. Let it tremble. Trembling does not mean the declaration is false. It may mean the prison is losing electricity. Fear does not need to destroy your life. It only needs to delay your obedience to your soul. This is how fear wins quietly. Not by ending your life, but by postponing it. Not by stopping the dream forever, but by persuading you to begin tomorrow. Not by closing every door, but by making you distrust the open one. There will come a moment when you must move with fear still present. You may write the message with your hand shaking. You may begin the project without knowing the ending. You may love again while remembering the wound. You may speak before confidence arrives. You may cross the threshold without a guarantee. That is not foolishness. That is the recovery of authority. The brave life is not a life without fear. It is a life where fear has been removed from the throne. Chapter 8. The free mind creates differently. The mind that has been freed does not create from the same place as the mind that is still imprisoned. The imprisoned mind imagines loss before it imagines possibility. It rehearses rejection before it receives love. It rehearses failure before it attempts movement. It rehearses lack before money even arrives. It rehearses betrayal before trust has had a chance to breathe. Then it calls this preparation. It calls this realism. But often it is not preparation, it is worship of the old wound. The free mind creates differently because it no longer accepts fear as the architect of the future. It can see risk without bowing to panic. It can plan without worshipping disaster. It can remember pain without letting pain become prophecy. It can imagine a larger life without apologizing to the old identity. It can hold vision with steadiness, not because evidence is already complete, but because authority has returned to the inner throne. Neville Goddard and Joseph Murphy matter here because both understood the creative seriousness of the inner world. Imagination is not merely entertainment. Repetition is not harmless. Feeling is not incidental. The subconscious receives what is impressed upon it with emotion, and the imagination rehearses the identity that the body slowly begins to accept as natural. This is why the free mind must be disciplined. Not tense, not obsessive, disciplined. A disciplined mind refuses to use imagination as a torture chamber. It refuses to rehearse humiliation as if humiliation were wisdom. It refuses to repeat scarcity as if scarcity were loyalty to reality. The free mind asks, what future am I practicing? What identity am I rehearsing? What emotional climate am I making familiar? The prisoner imagination says, what if it fails? What if they leave? What if there is not enough? What if I am not chosen? What if I am humiliated again? The sovereign imagination asks better questions. What if this is the beginning? What if I am supported? What if I can become the person required by the vision? What if the past was training and not prophecy? What if the future does not need permission from the wound? This does not mean the free mind becomes naive. It does not deny obstacles. It simply refuses to build an altar to them. It does not ignore difficulty. It refuses to let difficulty become identity. The free mind does not beg the future. It begins rehearsing it from authority. This rehearsal is not fantasy when it is joined with action. It becomes inner construction. Before the outer life changes, the inner posture changes. Before the opportunity is sustained, the identity able to sustain it must be formed. Before abundance can be received without sabotage, the nervous system must learn that abundance is safe. Before love can be welcomed without begging, the inner self must stop treating love as proof of worth and begin treating it as a field of mutual freedom. A captive mind creates from reaction. A free mind creates from command. Reaction says, I will think differently once the world changes. Command says, I will think from the new law until the world reorganizes around it. Reaction says, I will feel worthy when they choose me. Command says, I will stop abandoning myself now. Reaction says, I will believe in abundance when I see more money. Command says, I will no longer let lack write my imagination. This is the work. Rehearse the new identity not as pretending but as training. The body learned fear through repetition. It can learn freedom the same way. The mind learned limitation through emotional impression. It can learn authority through emotional impression. Use the imagination as a workshop. Enter it deliberately. See yourself moving with dignity. Hear yourself speaking with calm power. Feel the relief of no longer begging for permission. Practice the inner atmosphere of the person who is free. Then act from that atmosphere in the smallest available way. Send the message, make the decision, clean the room, write the page, protect the morning, tell the truth. Refuse the old sentence. Choose the thought that matches the declaration. The future receives its first shape in the workshop of imagination. Guard that workshop, it is sacred. Chapter 9, The New Declaration. There comes a moment when understanding is not enough. You can understand the chain and still wear it. You can identify the fear and still obey it. You can name the wound and still organize your future around it. Freedom requires declaration. Not the loud declaration made to impress others, but the quiet declaration made in the court of your own consciousness. The kind that says, this law is cancelled, this ruler is removed, this identity is no longer sovereign. This pain may be part of my history, but it is not the author of my destiny. A declaration is powerful because it gathers scattered awareness into a single line of authority. It does not pretend the past never happened. It does not deny grief, loss, betrayal, or fear. It simply refuses to let them remain on the throne. It says that what happened to you may explain a part of you, but it will not imprison the whole of you. It says the old internal government is dissolved and a new law is being written. The Declaration of Independence is more than a historical document for this meditation. It is a symbol of human refusal. It shows the moment when a people said that the old arrangement no longer carried moral authority. In the same way, the soul must sometimes review the private arrangements it has made with fear, shame, delay, unworthiness, and old pain. It must say, this government is no longer legitimate. This old empire no longer speaks for me. The outer document belonged to history. The inner declaration belongs to consciousness. Declare independence from fear, not by claiming you will never feel it again, but by refusing to let fear define the borders of your life. Declare independence from guilt, not by denying responsibility, but by refusing to remain a servant after the lesson has been learned. Declare independence from shame, not by pretending you never hurt, but by refusing to hide the light because the wound once called it dangerous. Declare independence from delay, not by rushing blindly, but by refusing to use preparation as a disguise for surrender. Declare independence from scarcity, not by despising money or matter, but by refusing to let lack become the atmosphere of your imagination. Declare independence from unworthiness, not by waiting until you feel perfect, but by recognizing that worth is not issued by applause. Write your declaration in your own words if you must. Speak it aloud, whisper it, put it in your journal, place your hand on your chest. Let the body hear the new law. The paper declared a nation free. Awareness must declare the soul free. But remember this, declarations are not magic if they are not practiced. The old identity will test you. It will return at the hour of stress. It will speak through familiar people. It will come wearing the clothing of logic. It will say, This is who you have always been. This is how life works. This is all you can expect. That is when the declaration must become behavior. You do not owe the old identity another season of obedience. You do not owe fear another year. You do not owe shame another hiding place. You do not owe your wound the right to write your future. The new declaration is not a mood. It is a government. It must become a schedule, a boundary, a thought, a choice, a refusal, a return to the center. It must be signed every morning when the old self reaches for the pen and you take it back. There will be days when you forget. Return. There will be days when you react from the old law. Return. There will be days when the wound speaks first. Return. Freedom is not ruined by a stumble. Freedom is strengthened by the act of returning to authority. Today make the declaration exact. Do not keep it vague. Name the old ruler, name the new law, name the action that proves the transfer of power. The new life begins at the first moment when the old pattern calls your name and you remember that you are no longer required to come. Chapter 10. The Nation of One. A free person becomes a nation within themselves. Not isolated, not arrogant, not unreachable, sovereign. They carry borders around their attention. They carry laws around their speech. They carry reverence around their time. They no longer allow every mood, memory, opinion, and fear to cross into the center of their life and rewrite the constitution of their soul. They understand that inner freedom is not a feeling that visits once and remains forever without care. It is a nation that must be protected, governed, renewed, and inhabited. To become a nation of one is to stop living as an occupied territory. It is to notice when old fear tries to reclaim land. It is to notice when guilt attempts to pass new legislation. It is to notice when comparison crosses the border carrying false evidence. It is to notice when the past returns wearing the uniform of realism. A sovereign person does not hate these visitors, but they do not hand them the keys. Mental borders are not coldness. They are stewardship. If a country had no borders at all, it would not be compassionate. It would be ungoverned. If your attention has no borders, every emergency, opinion, memory, and advertisement can invade the capital. If your speech has no laws, you will decree fear and then wonder why your life obeys. If your time has no reverence, the world will spend it for you. Discipline becomes devotion when it protects what is sacred. The American mind has always carried a deeper stream beneath its public language of progress. Emerson defended the sacred integrity of self-trust. Thoreau walked toward simplicity so the soul could hear truth without the crowd. William James explored belief as a living power inside experience. Their ideas are not museum pieces. They are alive whenever a person refuses imitation, enters silence, and chooses a belief worthy of a larger life. They are alive whenever the inner citizen rises and says, "I will no longer live as an exile inside myself." The nation of one needs a constitution, not a rigid doctrine, but a living set of laws that return you to authority. Write them simply. My attention is sacred. My imagination is not a place for rehearsing defeat. My past may inform me, but it may not govern me. My worth is not subject to public vote. My fear may warn me, but it may not command me. My silence is a sanctuary, not emptiness. My life is not an occupied territory. These laws may sound simple. Good. The deepest laws often do. Complexity can become another hiding place. The soul does not need 1,000 rules. It needs a few true laws practiced with sincerity. A free person becomes a nation within themselves. Let that sentence sink into the body. It does not mean you separate from humanity. It means you stop outsourcing your authority. It means love no longer requires self-abandonment. It means service no longer requires servitude. It means belonging no longer requires exile from your own truth. The nation of one is not built in a single dramatic hour. It is built through repeated acts of self-governance. You protect the morning. You choose the thought. You guard the word. You stop entertaining the old humiliation. You bless the past and remove it from office. You return to the breath. You act from the new law before the old emotion has fully disappeared. This is how an inner country is born. One day someone may notice that you have changed. They may not know what happened. They may say you seem calmer, stronger, more present, less available for drama. They are seeing the result of a government change. They are seeing the end of inner exile. Do not make a performance of it. Sovereignty does not need to shout. The deepest authority is quiet because it does not need to persuade the room that it exists. When the world becomes loud again, return to the nation within. When the old pattern tries to cross the border, ask for its papers. When fear claims citizenship, remind it that it may visit but not govern. When guilt attempts to pass another law, veto it with mercy. When the past demands the throne, offer gratitude and refuse coronation. You are not here to become untouchable. You are here to become unowned. That is inner freedom. Conclusion. When the fireworks fade. When the fireworks fade tonight, something in the outer world will become quiet again. The sky will return to darkness. The streets will empty. The flags will rest. The conversations will soften. The music will end. The celebration will become memory. But if you have truly listened, something in you does not need to fade with it. A light has been placed in a more private sky. A declaration has been spoken where no crowd could hear it. A question has entered the room of your life, and it will not leave simply because the day is over. You have heard that a nation can declare freedom, while a soul may still need to do the same. You have heard that fear can become a ruler, guilt can become an identity, regret can become a historian, and the old wound can become a false prophet. You have heard that the mind is a kingdom. Imagination is not a toy. Belief is architecture. Silence can reveal truth, and the pursuit of happiness may require the liberation of the one doing the pursuing. Do not reduce this to inspiration. Inspiration that is not practiced becomes another beautiful sound passing through a captive life. The question now is simple and severe. What will you no longer obey? What sentence will you stop repeating? What fear will you stop calling wisdom? What old agreement will you refuse to renew? What inner throne will you reclaim before the world teaches you to forget again? The declaration of inner freedom is not signed once. It is signed every morning when the old identity reaches for the pen and you take it back. It is signed when anxiety presents its plan and you refuse to call panic preparation. It is signed when guilt asks for another year of your life and you answer with mercy instead of servitude. It is signed when scarcity speaks through your imagination and you choose a thought worthy of abundance. It is signed when the past knocks and you open the door without handing it the keys. This freedom will not always feel dramatic. Sometimes it will feel like a calmer breath. Sometimes it will feel like closing your eyes before reacting. Sometimes it will feel like refusing to explain your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding it. Sometimes it will feel like doing the small disciplined thing that the new identity requires. Sometimes it will feel like silence. Do not underestimate the quiet victories. A chain does not need to fall with thunder to be broken. Sometimes it falls when the hand simply stops reaching for it. Today, America celebrates freedom. Let that celebration become a mirror, not a distraction. Let the public word liberty awaken the private responsibility of becoming free within. Let the fire above remind you of the fire within. Let the flag outside remind you of the unseen country of your mind. Let the old story of independence remind you that every soul has a moment when it must stop negotiating with the throne that diminished it. You are not too late. You are not too wounded. You are not too ordinary. You are not the final version of the story fear has been telling. Something in you has survived. Something in you has watched. Something in you has waited for the day when the inner government would change. That day does not need to arrive with permission from the world. It can arrive with a decision made in the silence of your own being. So let this be your private vow. I declare independence from fear. I declare independence from guilt. I declare independence from the identity that pain constructed. I declare independence from the lie that my past has more authority than my awakening. I declare independence from the habit of abandoning myself in order to be accepted by what cannot see me. I declare that my mind is no longer an occupied territory. I declare that my soul is not a servant of the old wound. I declare that the throne within is being returned to truth. When the last sound fades, remain awake. When the world moves on, remain faithful. When the old pattern returns, remain sovereign. The world may celebrate freedom for one day, but you were not born to remember freedom once a year. You were born to live it with every breath, every choice, every repeated thought, every act of courage, every refusal to bow to what no longer has the right to rule you. This book did not find you on July 4th by accident. It found you because some part of you was finally ready to declare independence from everything that was never truly you.